They pinned a dead patient's medication error on me, and they were so sure I had nothing to fight back with that they didn't even bother to look nervous. That was their first mistake. Their second was saying it out loud, in front of a room full of colleagues. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it actually happened. I have worked night shifts in the same hospital for 11 years. Not because I couldn't move to days, because nights suit me. The ward is quieter, the bureaucracy thins out, and you can actually hear a patient when they tell you something is wrong. My name is Sandra. I am 43 years old. I have 2 cats, a small apartment that smells like coffee and laundry, and until the night of February the 14th, I had a clean record without a single formal complaint in over a decade. February 14th. People always remember that date for flowers and chocolates. I remember it because it was the night Mr. Hoffner died. He was 71, post-operative, a routine hip replacement that had gone well enough in surgery, but poorly in the days after. He had a history of renal insufficiency that had been flagged in his chart, clearly, in 2 separate places. The attending physician had ordered a standard pain protocol, and somewhere between that order and what actually reached the patient, something went wrong. His kidneys couldn't process what he was given at the dosage he received. He deteriorated through the night. By 5 in the morning, he was gone. I was the nurse on duty for his corridor that night. Let me describe that ward to you so you understand what I was working in. Ward 4B runs 22 beds on night shift. The staffing ratio that night was 1 nurse to 11 patients, which is already pushing the outer limit of what is safe. The medication dispensing machine at the end of the corridor had been throwing error codes for 3 days. The pharmacy had been notified. Nothing had been fixed. The backup procedure for when the machine malfunctioned required a second nurse to co-sign manual dispensing, but there was no second nurse available on my half of the corridor that night because the colleague who was supposed to cover had called in sick, and the shift replacement had been assigned to the surgical ward instead due to a staffing emergency there. I documented all of this. I always document everything, not because I was planning for this moment, because 11 years on night shift teaches you that the night has a way of going sideways, and documentation is the only thing that stands between you and a story someone else gets to write. I made a note in the system at 22:47 that the dispensing machine had logged another error. I made a note at 23:15 that I was working the corridor alone. I escalated to the on-call coordinator at 23:20 about the staffing gap. I received a response at 23:44, confirming that no replacement was available. I noted the time I administered Mr. Hoffner's medication, the dosage, the lot number I pulled manually because the machine had locked the relevant drawer again. I noted that I followed the backup protocol as closely as possible, given that I had no co-signer, and that the machine was non-functional. I did everything right, or as right as you can do things when the system around you is broken and no one above you has bothered to fix it. Mr. Hoffner died at 05:12. The formal review process started the following Monday. I wasn't worried yet. I had been through incident reviews before. They are unpleasant, but usually procedural. You present your documentation, you explain your decisions, the committee notes the systemic factors, and they recommend changes. That is how it is supposed to work. Dr. Reinhardt was the senior attending physician on Mr. Hoffner's case. He had ordered the pain protocol. He had not flagged the renal insufficiency as a contraindication in his order, even though it was sitting right there in the chart. He was also, as it happened, the department head's closest ally, a man with 17 years of seniority, a research grant currently under review for renewal, and the kind of institutional standing that makes hospital administrators very careful about how they handle complaints involving his name. I did not know any of this was relevant yet. I was still thinking in terms of process. The first sign came on Tuesday morning. I had just finished a night shift and was changing out of my scrubs when the ward manager, Ms. Brandt, stopped me in the corridor. She had that particular expression people wear when they have already decided something, but want to appear like they haven't. Slightly too much eye contact. A smile that arrived before any warmth did. She said she just wanted to touch base before the formal review. She said these things were always difficult. She said she hoped I understood that the hospital had to be thorough. I told her I understood, and that I had complete documentation of everything from that night. She nodded. She said that was good. She said documentation was always helpful. She did not ask to see it. That was the moment. Not an alarm bell exactly, more like the particular stillness that comes before one. I went home. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with my documentation folder, which I had printed and kept at home as a matter of habit. And I read through it slowly. Everything was in order. Times, entries, escalations, machine error logs, staffing records, medication records. The dispensing machine's internal log was accessible through the pharmacy system, and I had already pulled a copy of it before the end of my shift. Something I had done automatically because the machine had been causing problems for days and I wanted a record. That log showed every error the machine had thrown that night, every locked drawer, every failed dispensing attempt, and a timestamp for each one. I looked at that log for a long time. Then I called my union representative. Her name is Petra. She has been representing nursing staff in this hospital for 9 years. She has the voice of someone who has sat through 100 of these meetings and is not impressed by any of it anymore. When I explained the situation, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send me everything tonight." I sent her everything. The formal review was scheduled for the following Thursday. On Wednesday afternoon, I received a written notification that the preliminary assessment had identified a potential medication administration error on my part as a contributing factor in Mr. Hoffner's death. The letter used careful, administrative language, but the meaning was clear. They were building a case with my name on it. I read the letter twice. I set it down on my kitchen table next to my coffee cup, which was still warm. I looked at it for a while. I did not cry. I was too angry for that, and the anger was the useful kind, the kind that goes very quiet and very focused instead of loud. I called Petra again. She'd already read the documents I sent. She said, "They're trying to make you the single point of failure." I said, "I know." She said, "Do they know what you have?" I said, "I don't think they've thought about it." She said, "Good. Let's keep it that way." The Thursday review was in a conference room on the 3rd floor. I arrived 7 minutes early, which is my habit. The room had a long table, institutional chairs, and the particular fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look slightly unwell. Petra was already there. Dr. Reinhardt came in with Ms. Brandt. There were 2 people from hospital administration I didn't recognize. There was a patient safety officer named Mr. Kemper, who I had met once before at a training seminar. Dr. Reinhardt sat down without looking at me. Ms. Brandt gave me the same smile from the corridor. Too early, too much. The meeting began with a summary of the incident. The patient safety officer read through the timeline. When he reached the section on medication administration, he paused and then he read a sentence that said the primary contributing factor had been identified as an error in dosage administration by the nursing staff on duty. I watched Dr. Reinhardt while this was being read. He was looking at the table, not at his notes. At the table, like a man who has already decided the weather is going to be fine and doesn't need to check. Ms. Brandt was nodding slowly. The administrative people were writing things down. Petra said, in her completely level voice, "We would like to present some additional documentation before any conclusions are drawn." Ms. Brandt said that there would be an opportunity for that. Dr. Reinhardt said, and this is the part I will remember for the rest of my life. He said it in that particular tone that men with 17 years of seniority use when they are not really talking to you, but performing for the room, he said. I think we all understand that in situations like this, the nursing staff's role in medication administration is the most direct point of contact with the patient. He paused. He said, "Nurses are, of course, replaceable. What I mean is that the institution can absorb a staffing change more easily than a disruption to medical leadership. We have to think about continuity." The room went quiet. Not dramatically quiet. Just the kind of quiet that happens when something has been said that everyone heard, but no one is immediately sure how to respond to. I looked at him. He was already moving on, shuffling papers, not looking at me. He had said it the way you say something you have said privately, many times and have forgotten, is not appropriate for public rooms. Petra wrote something on her notepad. I didn't look at what it was. I thought, "You just said that in front of a patient safety officer and 2 administrators. I thought, thank you. Mr. Kemper, the patient safety officer, cleared his throat. He said, perhaps we should hear the additional documentation before we proceed. Petra opened her folder. What followed was not dramatic in the way television makes these moments look. There was no single revelation that made everyone gasp. It was more like watching a load-bearing wall develop cracks. Slowly, then faster. Petra presented the dispensing machine error log first. 47 documented errors over a 72-hour period before Mr. Hoffner's death. The machine had been reported to pharmacy 3 times. There was a written escalation from the day shift 2 days prior, noting that the machine was unreliable and requesting urgent maintenance. There was no record of any maintenance being performed or any response to that escalation from hospital management. Ms. Brandt said, those are maintenance records. They aren't directly relevant. Petra said they are directly relevant to why the backup manual dispensing protocol was in use that night and to why that protocol could not be fully followed. She presented the staffing records next. The shift plan for February 14th showed 2 nurses scheduled for the corridor. The sick leave notification came in at 19:30. The replacement request was logged at 19:45. The replacement was redirected to the surgical ward at 20:10. There was a digital record of every step. There was my escalation to the on-call coordinator at 23:20 and the response at 23:44 confirming no replacement was available. One of the administrative people stopped writing and looked up. Petra presented my medication administration log. Time of access to the manual cabinet, which required a physical key and was logged electronically. The dosage I pulled, the lot number, the time of administration. All of it consistent with the physician's order. All of it documented in real time. Then she presented Dr. Reinhardt's original prescription order. She said, the order does not include a renal function flag. The patient's chart, which was available to the prescribing physician at the time of the order, contains 2 separate notations regarding renal insufficiency. The dosage prescribed was not adjusted to account for this. Dr. Reinhardt said, that is a clinical judgment question. Petra said, yes, it is. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, the documentation we have presented establishes that on the night in question, the nursing staff on duty was working alone on a corridor of 11 patients due to a staffing failure that was escalated and not resolved. The medication dispensing system was non-functional due to a maintenance failure that had been reported and not addressed. The manual backup protocol was followed as closely as possible under those conditions. The medication administered was consistent with the physician's order. The physician's order did not account for a documented contraindication in the patient's chart. She closed her folder. She said, we would like to know on what basis the preliminary assessment identified nursing administration as the primary contributing factor. The room was doing that quiet thing again. Ms. Brandt said, preliminary assessments are always subject to revision. Dr. Reinhardt said nothing. He was looking at the table again. Mr. Kemper said he would need to review all of the documentation submitted today before the assessment could be finalised. He said the preliminary finding would be suspended pending that review. He said he wanted copies of everything Petra had presented. Petra had already brought copies for everyone in the room. I had been sitting quietly through all of this. I had not raised my voice. I had not cried. I had not made a speech. I had brought my documentation and let it speak. But I want to be honest about something. There was a moment when Mr. Kemper asked for copies and Petra slid them across the table. When I looked at Dr. Reinhardt, and he finally looked back at me, just for a second. And in that second, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not guilt exactly. Something more like the particular shock of a man who had genuinely not considered that the person he was planning to sacrifice might have thought ahead. He had not considered it because he did not think nurses planned ahead. He thought we reacted. He thought we were interchangeable parts that could be swapped out when one became inconvenient. That was the thing he'd gotten wrong about me specifically and about the job in general. The meeting ended without resolution, which was actually a victory. The preliminary finding was suspended. That meant the formal disciplinary process was halted. That meant they could not proceed with what they had been planning without addressing everything Petra had put on the table. I walked out of that conference room and stood in the corridor for a moment. The fluorescent lights were the same as inside. The floor was the same pale linoleum it always is. A food cart went by. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor was beeping in the regular, unremarkable way monitors beep when everything is fine. Petra came out behind me. She said, "Well done." I said, "I just brought the paperwork." She said, "That's the whole job." The weeks after that meeting were not simple. I want to be clear about that because these stories sometimes make it sound like one good meeting fixes everything. It doesn't. The machinery of institutional protection moves slowly in both directions. Protecting its own people is slow. Being forced to stop protecting its own people is also slow. Mr. Kemper's review took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, I continued to work my night shifts. The ward was awkward. Miss Brandt was professionally polite in the way that is actually a form of hostility. Some of my colleagues were warm, others kept a careful distance, not because they thought I was wrong, but because proximity to an ongoing review feels dangerous when you're also on a night shift with no backup. I understood that. I didn't take it personally, much. Dr. Reinhardt, I saw twice in those 3 weeks. Both times, in corridor, passing moments. Both times he looked directly ahead. The second time, I nodded. He did not nod back. That told me everything I needed to know about how he was processing what had happened. He was not processing it as a lesson. He was processing it as an obstacle. The Morbidity and Mortality Conference was scheduled for the 4th week. This is a regular institutional event, a formal clinical review of adverse outcomes, attended by medical staff, nursing leadership, administration, and in this case, because of the pending review, Mr. Kemper from patient safety. It is the kind of meeting where the official narrative of what happened gets established, where the institution decides what it will say publicly and what it will record. This was the stage that mattered, not because I needed to humiliate anyone, but because what gets recorded in that conference is what shapes policy, what gets reported to oversight bodies, and what follows everyone involved in their professional record. Petra had requested that I be permitted to attend and present. This was unusual. Nursing staff do not typically present at M&M conferences. The request was granted, I think, because refusing it at this point would have looked worse than allowing it. I prepared for 2 days. I organised everything chronologically. I printed clean copies with timestamps highlighted. I prepared a 1-page summary that laid out the systemic factors in order: staffing failure, equipment failure, escalation failure, prescription oversight. I did not write anything accusatory. I wrote facts, dates, times, records, logs. I let the sequence speak. The morning of the conference, I made coffee at home. I stood at my kitchen window and drank it slowly. My documentation folder was on the table, the same folder I had been carrying back and forth for a month. I picked it up. I put on my coat. I went to work. The conference room was larger than the Thursday review room. There were about 20 people, medical staff I recognised, nursing leadership, 2 administrators, Mr. Kemper, and at the front of the room, Dr. Reinhardt, who was listed as the case presenter. He presented the case first. He was precise and clinical and very careful. He described Mr. Hoffner's condition, the surgical outcomes, the post-operative course, the deterioration. He described the medication protocol. He used language that was technically accurate and contextually incomplete. He said the case had raised questions about medication administration processes on the night shift. He said the hospital was committed to reviewing its protocols. He did not say, "I wrote an order that didn't account for a documented contraindication." He said the administration process on the night in question involves several non-standard elements due to equipment and staffing circumstances. Non-standard, that was the word he chose. As if the machine breaking down and the staff being alone on the corridor were weather events. Unforeseeable. Nobody's failure specifically. Mr. Kemper presented his review findings next. He was methodical. He went through each contributing factor. He named the dispensing machine maintenance failure. He named the staffing gap and the escalation that went unresolved. He named the documentation of the manual dispensing process and noted that it was consistent with protocol given the constraints in place. He noted the renal insufficiency notation in the patient's chart and its absence from the prescription order. He did not say, "Dr. Reinhardt made a clinical error." He said, "The prescribing documentation did not reflect all available patient information, but he said it. In that room, in front of everyone. Ms. Brandt was sitting 3 chairs to my left. I watched her face when Mr. Kemper said it. Something shifted in it. Not collapse exactly, more like the particular expression of someone recalculating. Then it was my turn. I stood up. I had practiced keeping my voice even, and I did. I presented the timeline. I walked through each document. I did not editorialize. I did not say, they tried to blame me. I said, here's what the machine log shows. Here's what the staffing record shows. Here is what my escalation shows. And here is the timestamp of the response. Here is what I administered and when. Here's the physician's order. I said, the preliminary assessment identified nursing administration as the primary contributing factor. The documentation does not support that conclusion. The contributing factors were systemic. The staffing gap was reported and not resolved. The equipment failure was reported and not repaired. The prescription did not account for documented patient information. The nursing staff on duty followed every protocol available to them under the conditions that existed that night. I paused. I said, I am presenting this not to assign blame, but because the way an institution describes what happened determines whether it changes what needs to change. If this is recorded as a nursing error, nothing about staffing ratios changes, nothing about equipment maintenance changes, nothing about prescription review changes. The same conditions will exist the next time, and there will be a next time. I sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Not the bad kind of quiet. The kind that means something landed. Dr. Reinhardt said, I think we're all in agreement that this was a complex, multifactorial situation. Somebody in the back of the room, I don't know who, said quietly, multifactorial, with a specific prescription gap. Dr. Reinhardt turned toward the voice. He found no one in particular to look at. The room had the quality of a space where everyone is looking at the table, but paying very close attention. Ms. Brandt said, we will obviously be reviewing our maintenance escalation protocols. Mr. Kemper said, and the staffing replacement protocols, and the prescription review process for patients with documented comorbidities. Ms. Brandt said, yes, of course. Dr. Reinhardt said nothing. The conference concluded with a formal recommendation for a structural review of all 3 areas: maintenance response, night shift, staffing coverage, and prescription documentation for at-risk patients. The preliminary finding against me was formally withdrawn and replaced with a finding of systemic failure across multiple institutional levels. That is not the same as vindication in the way movies show it. Nobody stood up and apologized. Nobody shook my hand and said they were wrong. The institution does not do that. What it does is quietly update its records and quietly change its language and quietly implement new procedures and never quite say out loud that the old procedures were wrong, because that would involve admitting liability. But the record now said systemic failure, not nurse error. That is the difference between a record that follows you and one that doesn't. In the weeks after the conference, I learned things secondhand, the way you always learn things in hospitals, through the particular grapevine of people who work nights and share information in corridor passing moments and break room conversations. Dr. Reinhardt's research, grant renewal, was delayed. I don't know the full details. I know that the review board for the grant had access to the M&M conference findings as part of its standard institutional review process. I know the delay happened. I know it was not a small thing for him. A man who had said nurses are replaceable was now sitting with a very replaceable feeling gap in his funding calendar. Ms. Brandt was reassigned from ward management to a quality improvement role. The official language was that this was a lateral move reflecting the hospital's commitment to systemic improvement. The unofficial language, which I heard in the break room, was that she had lost the confidence of the nursing staff and that several formal feedback submissions had been made through the new staff feedback process that had been implemented as part of the structural review. The dispensing machine on Ward 4B was replaced within 6 weeks. The new one has not thrown a single error code since. I notice it every time I walk past it at the start of a shift. A small thing, a working machine, the kind of thing that should have been unremarkable all along. The staffing protocols were revised. Night shift coverage gaps now require a mandatory escalation to a senior administrator, not just the on-call coordinator, and a documented response within 1 hour. This is not perfect, but it is better. It's the kind of better that means the next nurse who works alone on that corridor at 3 a.m. has a slightly better chance of not being where I was. I did not celebrate any of this. That might sound strange, but celebration felt wrong for something that had cost a man his life. Mr. Hoffner deserved better than the system he was in. He deserved a machine that worked, and a ward that was staffed, and a prescription that accounted for what his chart said about his kidneys. He didn't get any of that. What he got instead was a system that, when it failed him, tried to find the smallest, most replaceable person to carry the weight of that failure. I think about him sometimes, on night shifts. Not in a haunted way, more in the way that certain patients stay with you, not because of what you did or didn't do, but because of what their case revealed about the work and what the work costs when the structures around it fail. I stayed in nursing. I want to be clear about that, because I think sometimes these stories end with the narrator walking away, finding a new life, leaving the field that hurt them. I understand that impulse, but I have been doing this for 11 years, and I am good at it, and the ward needs people who are good at it, and I refuse to let the Dr. Reinhardts of the world have the satisfaction of clearing the field of everyone who might one day hold them accountable. I did make changes. I now keep a personal documentation file for every shift I work, not just incident nights, every night, times, staffing levels, equipment status, escalations, responses. I keep it at home in the same kind of folder I carried into that conference room. I update it within 24 hours of each shift. It takes about 10 minutes. It is the most important 10 minutes of my professional life. I joined the union committee, not just as a member, as an active participant. I attend meetings. I review proposed policy changes. I give feedback on staffing proposals. I am the person who raises her hand and asks, what happens when the machine breaks down? I am the person who says, what is the backup protocol? And who is responsible for it? And how is that responsibility documented? I am not popular with certain people for doing this. I am fine with that. Petra told me once, after one of the more contentious committee meetings, that I had become the kind of person that institutions find inconvenient. She said it as a compliment. I took it as one. I still work nights. I still prefer them. The ward is quieter. The bureaucracy thins out. You can hear a patient when they tell you something is wrong. But I work them differently now. Not with fear exactly, more with a particular clear-eyed awareness of the gap between what the institution says it does and what it actually does when something goes wrong. I have seen that gap. I have stood in it. I know its dimensions. The documentation folder is still on my kitchen table. A new one, updated, current. I made coffee this morning and it was sitting there while I drank it. Just a folder, just paper, just facts and times and machine logs and staffing records. Nothing dramatic about it, except that it is the thing that kept someone else's story from becoming mine permanently. The last time I saw Dr. Reinhardt was in the hospital cafeteria about 2 months after the M&M conference. He was at a table with 2 colleagues. I was getting coffee. He saw me. I saw him see me. I poured my coffee. I put the lid on the cup. I turned and walked to the door. I did not nod. I did not smile. I did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction in either direction. I just walked out with my coffee and went back to work. That is the whole story. There is no bigger ending than that. There is no courtroom verdict, or public apology, or dramatic final scene. There is a man who said nurses are replaceable, sitting in a cafeteria. And there is me walking out the door with my coffee, still employed, still documented, still here, still here. That is the part they didn't plan for. That I would still be here. I think about that sometimes, on the quiet nights, when the ward is settled, and the monitors are doing their regular, unremarkable beeping, and the corridor is lit by the low, overnight lights that make everything look slightly underwater. I think about what they expected to happen. They expected me to be gone, quietly, professionally, with the kind of institutional language that makes a firing sound like a mutual decision. They expected the problem to disappear. Instead, the problem is still here, working the night shift, keeping records, attending committee meetings, and drinking terrible cafeteria coffee. I have made my peace with the fact that what happened, happened. Not because it was fair, it wasn't. Not because the system has fully corrected itself, it hasn't, but because carrying the weight of what they tried to do to me, on top of the actual weight of the job, would eventually break something that I don't want broken. Mr. Hoffner's family filed a formal complaint with the Hospital Oversight Board. I know this because the Patient Safety Office contacted me as part of their witness documentation process. I provided my records, I told them what I knew, I told them the truth, which is that Mr. Hoffner deserved better care than the system was set up to give him that night, and that the system knew it was inadequate and chose not to fix it before it mattered. What the Oversight Board does with that complaint is not in my hands. What is in my hands is the documentation I keep, the shifts I work, the committee meetings I attend, and the particular stubborn fact of my continued presence in a ward that was supposed to be done with me. There's a new nurse on Ward 4B now, a young woman named Lena, who started 4 months ago. She works days mostly, but occasionally covers nights. She asked me once, early in her time on the ward, how I stay organised on a busy shift. I told her about my documentation habits. I told her to always keep a copy of her escalations. I told her to note the time of every significant decision and every response she receives to a report. She looked at me like I was being slightly paranoid. I said, I hope you never need it, but keep it anyway. She keeps it now. I've seen her notebook. She's more thorough than I was at her stage. That folder on her desk, the same kind I carry to every shift, is also a kind of payoff. Not the dramatic kind. The kind that compounds slowly over time, like interest on something you invested in when you were too tired and too angry to know you were investing. I pour my coffee. I pick up my folder. I go to work. Still here.